Okay, this is the first video lecture for Chapter 7. You may have noticed in the syllabus that I've broken Chapter 7 up into 3 different lectures. This is the one on international organizations. Now, note that when I say IOs or international organizations, I also mean international governmental organizations or IGOs, so those terms are interchangeable. The thing here we're talking about is that these are organizations that are agreed upon and formulated by the states to do the functions that we're about to talk about. So first of all, let's talk about our modern era of international organizations. At the end of World War II, particularly the winners of World War II, as we'll see how that is also somewhat more prominent later, that they got together and tried to come up with a system to where we would have more international order and prevent another world war. And so the United Nations Charter was agreed upon in 1945, originally with 51 states. And the membership doubled by the 1960s. The United Nations now has 193 members. And we're going to be talking most of today about the United Nations because that's a good example of an international organization, probably the most prominent one in the world. Now, also towards the end of World War II, the Bretton Woods Conference was meant to try to create a global economic structure for the most part. So we'll be talking about these particular organizations later on and not in quite as much detail. The World Bank and the International Monetary Fund and the forerunner to the World Trade Organization were all pretty much initiated in this particular conference and is now, to this day, this is the basic structure of our modern world in the international system. So let's look at the reason why we have international organizations, and we'll look at it from 2 different perspectives. First of all, from the institutionalist perspective, the IOs were created by the states to serve their needs. So what we're doing here is with these international organizations from this particular point of view is that we're facilitating norms of cooperation and compromise. We tend to find that political action is somewhat easier when we can achieve it through some consensus. And we also have noticed over the centuries that modern sovereign states usually do follow the rules and try to keep their commitments. So these norms of cooperation and compromise are institutionalizing and gaining legitimacy to become the standard operating procedures in the international system. Now, from the realist view, you can see how subtle these distinctions are between these 2 perspectives. From the realist view, international organizations or IOs are created by the states to serve their needs. So as you can see, that's the exact same sentence that I used in the previous slide, but I have a different emphasis here on the states creating these organizations to serve their needs. So states, as we have talked about through the realist perspective, states are pursuing their self-interest and they're using these IOs in order to do that. And they certainly will delegate to an IO when the costs are less than the benefits. And we see that there's several issues that states tend to delegate more to the IOs than others. For example, environmental issues and perhaps human rights issues and health issues and things like that. So those are a little bit more attractive for states to delegate down to, so because the IOs can do those more efficiently than a state would, particularly different states tackling it at their own expense. Now, of course, with the realist view, sovereignty is still the reigning norm out there in the world. So from this perspective, the sovereign states are using those IOs as needed. And also from the realist view, the IOs are necessarily dominated by the powerful states such as the United States and China and Great Britain, because they were created by the states to serve their needs. So that's the basic distinctions between those two perspectives. Now, the role of the IOs in the world today has two seemingly different type of roles here. They can serve as an interactive forum, such as the UN General Assembly does, we'll talk more about here in a minute, as well as an independent actor out there in the world system. As far as the interactive forum goes, the general norm building there is that diplomacy is becoming more and more of an alternative to the battlefield, where people will die and property is destroyed. And we see that in these interactive forums that resolutions and certain conventions can lead to global treaties. For example, the UN Convention on the Law of the Seas was started in the UN. The Kyoto Global Warming Protocol was started there, as well as the International Criminal Court Treaty. Most of those were started at something like the UN General Assembly, a resolution. Now, as an independent actor, the IO serves as a provider of global public goods, like you may be familiar with the WHO. Well, not that WHO, the World Health Organization WHO. A very interesting story I'll talk about later on when we get into the health issues of the global system, that they had a very successful program to eradicate smallpox. And they did it a lot faster, a lot cheaper, a lot more efficient than all the big sovereign states were doing separately. As well as a provider of global public goods, as an independent actor, these IOs have what we call supranational aspects or legal aspects, where the states actually give way to international rules, such as with the World Trade Organization, which we'll talk about more in a later chapter, and the International Court of Justice, which we'll talk about in the next lecture, that the states agree to abide by the rules that are set by these organizations. Now, if you look in the textbook in Figure 7.1, you'll see, particularly since right after the World War II, there's a dramatic growth of international organizations for several reasons. States can achieve goals through IOs that they can't achieve alone. And I've already alluded to a few of those, such as the eradication of smallpox or certain type of peacekeeping forces that we'll get into. We, in our new global world, we have set the structure for international interdependence, more economic contact, and there's more transnational problems to deal with as the world becomes more populated and more complex. We see a lot of cases where some states themselves are just unable to provide security for their own people. So the IOs are growing in numbers to try to help that. And of course, the smaller states can gain strength through this collective action process of the international organizations. And then we've seen some pretty major successes of international organizations that keeps to reinforce the fact that they exist. Means that there are some amount of successes with these international organizations, even though the powerful states such as the United States can literally kind of do their own thing and perhaps even just kind of ignore or push an IO out of the way at times. But when it serves everybody's purpose, we've seen some major successes. We'll talk about a few of those as we go. Now, what I want to focus on primarily for this particular lecture is looking at the United Nations, because it is the one organization that has virtually universal membership. You're not really recognized as a state in the world system unless you're a member of the United Nations, and the United Nations recognizes you as a state. There have been a few controversies over time as far as the recognition of certain states. We can touch on a few of those. But the United Nations serves as somewhat of a symbol of international order because of the fact that all the states are members and that it does have a lot of respect and prestige, even though it may not have a whole lot of power, as we'll get into here in a minute. The General Assembly is the main interactive forum that we talked about, where each state has one vote, and this is where the major resolutions get passed that may have more symbolic value than anything else, but at least it is providing the forum and the opportunity for states to come together and express what perhaps a majority of the world would like to pursue. Now, the United Nations is broken up into several limited membership councils to where you have a little bit more efficient, smaller bodies. We'll talk about a few of these, particularly the Security Council in detail here in a minute, where you've got 15 members, 5 of which are the permanent members of the UN Security Council, called the P5, which I'll refer to here a few times. They have an Economic and Social Council with lots of different agencies that do a lot of different things. We'll look at the flow chart here in a minute. And I've already talked a little bit about the International Court of Justice. We'll talk about that in more detail in the next chapter, or the next lecture, on international law. So let's look at the org chart for the United Nations system. Here are the principal organs over here. We've talked about the General Assembly, and we'll get more into the Security Council. There's the Economic and Social Council, and the Secretariat is the administrative arm. We'll talk more about the ICJ later. As far as the General Assembly has jurisdiction over these programs and funds, which are set up primarily by voluntary contributions. So the General Assembly and the basic Secretariat has a budget that is provided for by the member states. Well, these programs and funds are literally funded by additional voluntary funds. You may have heard of some of these: UN Development Program, UN Environmental Program, UNICEF. Might have actually treated for UNICEF as a kid. World Food Program. These are all programs and funds. And UNCTAD is a unique agency that allows corporations to file claims against states, and states able to file claims against corporations if there's any disputes there. We also have here under the arm of the Economic and Social Councils, we've got several functional commissions here that you may have heard of. This is where also the economic commissions are for additional development. Let's see, we've got over here the specialized agencies. These are the more autonomous agencies here that we've talked about a few of them already. We see the IMF is relatively autonomous from the UN, but also certainly connected. We've already talked about the World Health Organization and the World Bank. These are agencies that coordinate perhaps with the UN, but are relatively autonomous. We've got the World Intellectual Property Organization right there. Here we have some related organizations that are also fairly autonomous. There's the WTO right there, and we've already talked about the International Atomic Energy Agency, which actually does report to the General Assembly and the Security Council, as we see right there. Excuse me, that's this one right here. This one's talking about the WTO. Let's see, we've got also reporting to the Security Council, we've got the peacekeeping operations, which I want to talk about a little bit more detail later on. So that gives you kind of a general idea of how expansive the United Nations system is as far as trying to provide assistance to the states out there in the world. Now, as far as the leadership of the UN, the head person is the Secretary General. The Security Council, as we'll talk about here in a few minutes, has enormous responsibility as far as calling a lot of shots here. Now, the Security Council nominates one or more of these candidates for the Secretary General. The new Secretary General is Antonio Guterres, who was just appointed last year. His 5-year term just started in January of 2017, and he's the head of the administrative staff called the Secretariat. Showed you on the chart there, staff of about 15,000 people, mostly there in the New York City headquarters of the UN. Now, there's a lot of potential for political maneuvering when these leadership positions change, because the P5 can veto any candidates per their own interest, and that has happened in the past, where a candidate perhaps from India was vetoed, and this is done behind closed doors, so we don't really know whether the United States might have vetoed it or China might have vetoed it for geopolitical interests, as far as not wanting a UN leader that is from a rival state. So as a result, the leader of the UN typically tends to be somebody who is less politically controversial, and the leaders are somewhat restrained, largely administrative, but they do have a lot of power of global public opinion, and they have expressed their independence on a fairly regular basis, because the UN is considered their own player out there in the world. Again, their power is limited, but the UN does see itself as a separate player from the states. And there have been cases where, in just the recent past, where Ban Ki-moon, who was the previous Secretary General, when he took office in 2006, that President George Bush kind of hit him up to provide support, because as we'll see here in a minute, the UN did not support the Iraq War when the United States invaded Iraq in 2003. The UN was not a part of that because of the veto of a couple of other states. So George Bush kind of lobbied Ban Ki-moon to throw his support in behind the Iraq War, because it was going pretty badly by 2006. But Ban Ki-moon decided not to do that. So again, expressing some fair amount of independence there once they become leaders of the UN. So let's talk about the UN Security Council that has 15 members, and this is the group that's responsible for deciding on what kind of military or enforcement or peacekeeping processes are necessary out there in the world to perhaps stop a major conflict such as the one in Syria or in Sudan. Now, as we'll talk about, the UN Security Council is somewhat controversial because of the 5 permanent members. And as I said before, the 5 permanent members are the winners of World War II. United States, Russia, United Kingdom, France, and China. And each one of these 5 permanent members has veto power. So as you can see already, is that if there's a resolution on the table that just one of those 5 is not happy with or can't comply with, they can veto it, and then virtually that resolution or that action is somewhat stymied, because it has to have all 5 of these agree. And so as you can pretty much guess, that creates a lot of confusion and controversy and perhaps inactivity that these 5 major players, that if they could agree on, could perhaps solve some major problems. But if they can't agree on it, then they are somewhat powerless to proceed. Now, there's 10 non-permanent members in the UN Security Council, and they each serve a 2-year term, and they They rotate on a regional basis. These are the states that are currently on the UN Security Council at this time, just starting a new 2-year term. And as I said, South America will have a rotating members. Africa will have rotating members so that they at least have those non-permanent members spread out each 2-year term. Now, as far as some of the issues with the UN Security Council, the fact that each of those 5 permanent members has veto power, that's a severe lack of democracy, because just one out of the entire group could prevent something from happening. We also see major geographic and demographic imbalances there because of the winners of World War II were missing representation from Africa and some other areas. So it's not necessarily an accurate reflection of current power realities, particularly when you consider that 2 of the most powerful economies in the world, Germany and Japan, unfortunately they were losers of World War II and did not get included in these situations. And so that, as you can see, there's quite a bit of complaints about the UN Security Council structure. So you've got questions. Should you give more members a veto power, or should you just eliminate that altogether? So that's some pretty major questions there, and either one of those would be difficult, because an amendment to the UN Charter requires a 2/3 vote of the General Assembly, but even more important, it requires that all 5 of the permanent members would agree to that amendment, and it's unlikely that all 5 of those would agree to eliminate their veto power or to give it to an additional country. Now, as I mentioned before, there's rivalries, geopolitical rivalries. China would certainly be reluctant to admit Japan or India into the permanent 5, or adding more to the permanent members. And then also admitting India could also alarm Pakistan. So you've got lots of issues out there among our sovereign states that would make change difficult. Now that I've said that, here's your question that I want you to consider, that after you watch the rest of the video here, you will have an opportunity to post your response on the discussion forum for this particular lecture. And what I want you to consider here is that, could you think of a reasonable reform to this structure that all 5 of the permanent members might agree with? Is there any idea that you might have to alleviate this particular controversy of the permanent 5 having this veto power? And you'll certainly want to watch the remainder of this video to give you a little bit more information as far as how you might want to respond to that. But just come up with, again, there's no right or wrong answers here. Just whenever you give everybody the opportunity to provide some insight on what might be an interesting idea to reform or restructure that particular issue there, where all the 5 permanent members have this veto power. So think about that, and I'll remind you here a little bit later to post your response on the discussion forum in Moodle. Some more issues over time that we've had at the UN Security Council back in the at the end of the World War II, the People's Republic of China, was mainland China. When they went communist, the United States and the UN did not recognize them as members of the UN. They shifted it to the Republic of China on Taiwan, which was the island of Formosa at that time, where our ally was the dictator Chiang Kai-shek. And it was because of that particular little switch that we were able to pass the resolution on the Korean War, because the People's Republic, the mainland China, was no longer part of the Security Council, and Russia had actually boycotted that because of our not recognizing the mainland China. But that got switched back in 1971. So again, um, this is also kind of at the root of why there is dissension, conflict between mainland China and Taiwan, even to this day. Also, after numerous UN Security Council resolutions, the conflict in Sudan, particularly the Darfur region, where there was genocide being perpetrated on the indigenous peoples there, and but after numerous resolutions, the peace process in Sudan was actually initiated by a trade association in Africa, National Group on Assistance and Development there, and it was mediated by the African Union. So again, that just goes to show you that even though the UN is kind of serving as a forum to try to resolve these issues around the globe, sometimes progress can't be made unless it's done locally or regionally by the players there that are directly involved in the conflict or directly being impacted by the death and destruction and instability. So that just goes to show you that it's still a real complicated world out there. And just not more than about a week or so ago, the as far as how the difficulties for the Security Council to come together, well, Russia and China has just vetoed a U.S.-backed resolution in the Security Council that was meant to sanction Syrian President Assad for using banned chemical weapons, in this case chlorine bombs, which is a banned chemical. And so Russia and China again have different geopolitical interests in the United States. Russia, of course, is allied with President Assad, so again they're going to be reluctant to sanction him for something like that because they're potentially helping him try to win this war in his country. China also may have more sympathetic reasons for backing a more authoritarian leader, since China prefers an authoritarian system. So you may have some reasons there that would prevent all 5 of the permanent members on the Security Council to agreeing on that. More tensions, particularly between the UN in general and the United States. The United States, arguably the most powerful country in the world. Well, no argument there militarily and economically. So as the most powerful state in the world, the U.S., like any major power in general, would be reluctant to share or give up power. So that is a constant issue. And as we'll see here in a minute, when the United States was attacked by the terrorists on 9/11, the United States quickly shifted into a unilateral mode to try to take care of this problem and not be held back or hamstrung or handcuffed by international organizations. And that has since kind of come back to bite us a little bit. We've shifted back a little bit more multilateral than that because of the issues that came up in the Iraq War. But even then, the United States and our general population is going to be reluctant to sacrifice power to an international organization. So typically when the U.S. feels like it's in our best interest to not comply with a UN resolution, then that's what we'll do. And so the U.S. often acts unilaterally when it's opposed to a UN concept, and then conversely, when the U.S. is in the lead and wants the UN to fall in behind it, well, then our power is amplified it, and then we will try to use the UN to line up behind us. So that's, I guess you could say, an advantage of being the superpower. The U.S. is also in the minority on many issues that concern poor states, us being a very rich state, comparatively speaking. So what happens then is that the General Assembly is sometimes used as a forum to criticize the rich states and becomes somewhat of an outlet for the poor states of the world to come together and say, how can we get a better break? How can we get a better deal in this global system where we lack power? And as a result of some conflicts with the UN, the U.S. has in the past withheld its dues. In the 1980s, the UN was trying to somewhat sanction the Reagan administration for their activities, particularly in South America, supporting anti-communist dictators, that sort of thing. And then post 9/11, the unilateral approach with the fight on terror and the fact that we could not get the UN to fall in behind us, the U.S. withheld some dues there. As far as I know, I think we have paid back up on our dues. And as I've said before, in 2003, the Bush administration was pretty much determined to invade Iraq, but they did want to get a UN endorsement on that, and they sent former General and Chairman of Joint Chief of Staffs Colin Powell to make the case for the United States by delivering the speech to the UN. However, both France and Russia said that they were going to veto any resolution to invade Iraq. So therefore, it was pretty much a unilateral effort by the United States, and our main ally was the UK in that war. Now let's talk a little bit about the UN peacekeeping forces, because that's a vital arm of the UN that's under the direction of the UN Security Council, and it's responsible for sending neutral troops into these hot spots to try to quell the violence or perhaps even stop it from escalating into a full-scale war. Interestingly enough, these UN peacekeeping forces are not in the original UN Charter. As you will read, the UN Charter, the initial intent was that the UN would have use of the respective Security Council countries' forces. So you can imagine if the UN could literally just contract your forces there of China and Russia and the United States, they would have a massive force that would be able to go in and pretty much stop anything from happening inside an unstable country. That was the original intent. Of course, our sovereignty and reluctance to share military power, of course, has really kept that from happening. So what we have is a relatively small peacekeeping force that gets sent to various areas that all 5 of the permanent members can agree on. And of course, the point is for the peacekeeping forces to play a neutral role, not to get involved in either side. Again, the authority is granted by the Security Council. All 5 permanent members have to agree before a peacekeeping force is sent. The funds, however, are voted on by the General Assembly, and the peacekeeping force is actually a separate budget from the UN administrative budget. And again, special assessments are made against member states' dues, so to speak, to pay for the peacekeeping forces. Again, the UN acts as a buffer between the combatants, and just the presence alone of the Blue Helmet force there could potentially prevent reaching a threshold to where violence would escalate. Now, of course, there have been cases where it did not work, such as Rwanda, which I talked about before, where we had a peacekeeping force there for a few months, but they were unable to stop the violence from progressing into a massive situation to where over 800,000 men, women, and children were literally murdered in the span of just about 100 days. So, and of course, skirmishes still could break out, but generally peacekeeping forces, just their presence does seem to make a difference. Now, of course, that's what's tricky about it. How soon do you send them? Can you send them too late? Since 1945, there's been over 9 million soldiers sent. Over 2,800 have died. Interestingly enough, you can look on the website there. The vast majority of the UN peacekeeping troops come from the least developed countries. These 4 states right here comprise over 1/3 of the total 100,000 troops that are sent from various countries to serve as the peacekeeping forces. To give you a comparison, there's only about 65 people total out of this 100,000 from the United States. 65 peacekeeping troop members. Now, the peacekeeping has budget constraints. It's got hampered by the veto power. And again, where this is probably, again, a sacrifice of power or being subjected to international jurisdiction, the United States troops have for a long time been exempted from international court jurisdictions, and that was still under effect under President Obama, will still probably remain in effect, that because the United States has so many troops in so many countries, that something could potentially go wrong, and the United States does not want to have to be subject to an international criminal court that would be trying a United States soldier. Now, we'll talk more next time or next week about the International Criminal Court and how that works in a later lecture. Here's where the current United Nations peacekeeping operations are at present. So these are acronyms for each peacekeeping mission. So there's still one stationed in Haiti, the Darfur peacekeeping mission there. So you can see there's a relatively new one in South Sudan, because when South Sudan got their independence from Sudan, they fairly quickly fell into conflict, and so there was a peacekeeping force sent there fairly recently. So you can see where these hot spots are, where the peacekeeping operations are in place. Here's just a list of those same missions and how long they've been there. So you can see some of those have been there for a long time, and this tells you what the acronym means, so you can pause on this as you see fit to look at those. More aspects with UN peacekeeping, in that states frequently don't support financially or politically. If you want to look at the dues, there's a lot of states that don't contribute very much to the peacekeeping operations. And as I've said before, the self-interests of the Security Council have to agree, because those 5 permanent members have veto power, which could prevent any action being taken. The Security Council has authorized only 7 at this time. There's another historical piece of tidbit here. In the Balkan War in 1992, that war was about to flare up. UNC only authorized 7,000 troops there, and it wasn't until some peacekeeping troops were taken hostage before the international community started to get involved, and then the war ended in 1995 after 3 years of ethnic cleansing in the Balkan region there. This is the former Yugoslavia that broke apart into what is now about 6 or 7 different states. And so when the United Kingdom and the United States started to get involved, then the war ended relatively quickly after that. And with UN peacekeeping, of course, enforcement is best when it's sent before trouble starts. No guarantee that it's going to prevent things from happening, but that's one of the difficulties of this decision making, is that if we send them too early, are we going to literally spark dissent, or are we going to how are we going to do this, as far as if a leader of the country does not necessarily want us there? So that's another thing where in some cases a leader may not want peacekeeping troops sent there, and then when it's too late, then of course then they would certainly want them there. So that shows you how difficult this decision making can be. Just a couple of more things about the budget of the UN, and this gives you another indication of how international organizations are hampered. They have some difficulties with funds, and so that the amount of resources affects their power to do things. The annual regular budget for the UN is approximately $5 billion annually. And this gives you an example. The average U.S. citizen pays about $2,000 a year of their taxes that goes to the military, when about $15 of our taxes per year goes to the UN. So that's a dramatic difference, and that's something that culturally our citizens would still probably prefer. We would still prefer to have a very strong military, willing to pay more tax dollars for it, less willing to have a strong international organization, or even certainly more or less willing to delegate more power to it or to devote more of our resources to it. That would be a sacrifice of our power. That's something that's very difficult for a human being to do, particularly a human being that's been socialized into a very powerful country like the United States. The peacekeeping budget, as you can see comparison there, is a $7.8 billion budget. Now this gives you an idea for comparison. The New York City Police and Fire Department budgets are $7 billion, almost as much as the entire peacekeeping budget. So that shows you how the UN has to deal with a lot of issues with relatively small amount of money, comparatively speaking. And so you could certainly argue that you get a pretty big bang for your buck through the UN, just the fact that they can provide some resources and presence around the world on a relatively small amount of money, as you can see. The assessments for the UN budget are based on national wealth. The United States provides 22% of that. Japan and Germany, of course, which are not on the Permanent Security Council, they supply a big chunk of the budget, relatively speaking. So that's another reason why you would say, well, it's odd that Japan and Germany do not have more say, considering how much they contribute. France, China, and UK, the other three permanent, you don't even see Russia on this list here. So 6 countries at about 2% or more. And then, so these 12 countries here pay about 75% of the entire budget, with only 5% of the votes in the General Assembly. So you can see it's very lopsided as far as financing goes. But again, as I've already talked about with UN Security Council, very lopsided in that direction as far as the veto power and having the power to decide where military forces are going to go to help some conflict-ridden area. And then 25% of the states of the world are at that minimum level of about 0.001% of their budget. Okay, so now don't forget to post your response to my question that I posed earlier about the UN Security Council. And you'll do this on the Moodle discussion forum labeled Chapter 7 Video Lecture on International Organizations.